The wind carried the scent of snow and something darker, something that made Cale Thornridge's wolf snarl with an aggression he hadn't felt in decades. He stood on the ridge overlooking the southern border of his territory, the vast expanse of the northern lands stretching behind him like a frozen kingdom that had bent to his will through blood and dominance. For 30 years, he had ruled these lands with an iron fist, crushing rebellions before they could take root, negotiating treaties that always favored his pack, and maintaining order through a reputation that made even the boldest alphas think twice before challenging him. He was the supreme alpha, the wolf of winter, the male whose very name could silence a room full of warriors. But standing there on that ridge, breathing in air that tasted of fear and desperation, Cale felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement that would crack the foundation of everything he had built on willful ignorance and strategic apathy. His beta, Marcus, stood beside him with the uncomfortable posture of someone who knew they were about to witness something catastrophic. They had been conducting routine border inspections for 3 days, a formality Cale usually delegated, but had decided to oversee personally after reports of increased rogue activity near the mountain passes. The official story was that bandits were using the remote terrain to smuggle goods between territories, avoiding the tariffs and regulations that governed legitimate trade. Cale had known for years that goods was a polite euphemism, a word his council used in official reports to avoid acknowledging what everyone quietly understood: omegas. They were trafficking omegas, stolen from smaller packs or lured with false promises, sold to the highest bidder in markets that existed in the gray spaces between territorial jurisdictions. He had told himself it wasn't his problem, that the southern border was technically shared governance with 3 other packs, that intervening would destabilize the fragile peace he had negotiated, that some battles weren't worth fighting. He had been lying to himself, and some part of him had always known it. The scent hit him like a physical blow, cutting through every rationalization and excuse he had ever constructed. It was sweet and wild, like night-blooming flowers in summer storms, completely incongruous with the frozen landscape around them. But underneath that sweetness was terror so pure, it made his teeth ache, and something else, something ancient that called to the deepest parts of his wolf with an urgency that bordered on violence. Mate. The word resonated through every cell of his body, a truth so absolute it rewrote his understanding of reality in an instant. Cale had never believed in the old stories about mate bonds, had dismissed them as romantic nonsense used to justify poor decisions and weaker wolves' inability to control their impulses. He had assumed he would never experience. It had built his entire identity around being above such base instincts. He had been catastrophically wrong. Before Marcus could ask what was happening, Cale was moving, his human form blurring into his wolf mid-stride. He was massive even by alpha standards, his winter-white fur marked with silver that gleamed like frost under the pale sunlight. He covered the distance to the hidden valley in minutes, his supernatural speed eating up terrain that would have taken humans hours to traverse. The scent grew stronger with every leap, pulling him forward with a compulsion that overrode every strategic thought, every careful calculation. His wolf didn't care about politics or consequences. His wolf knew only that their mate was in danger, was afraid, was suffering, and that was unacceptable on a level that transcended reason. Marcus and the rest of his guard struggled to keep pace, their own wolves responding to their alpha's urgency, even if they didn't understand its source. The valley opened up before him like a wound in the landscape, a natural amphitheater carved by ancient glaciers and hidden from casual observation by the way the mountains folded around it. But Cale's enhanced senses picked up everything his careful ignorance had allowed him to overlook for years. The wooden structures built into the rock face, designed to be dismantled quickly if necessary. The scent markers of dozens of different packs, rogues, and humans, all mixed together in the characteristic pattern of a black market. The smell of fear and unwashed bodies and the particular desperation that came from people who had lost all hope. And underneath it all, growing stronger with every step, the scent of his mate. He shifted back to human form as he crested the final rise, his alpha aura flooding the valley like a tsunami of dominance that sent every wolf present to their knees involuntarily. Good. He wanted them to know exactly who was about to end their enterprise. The market spread out before him in all its sickening efficiency. Cages built from silver-reinforced steel, small enough that the Omegas inside couldn't stand or fully extend their limbs. A raised platform that served as an auction block, currently occupied by a young male Omega who couldn't have been more than 19, his eyes glazed with whatever drugs they had used to keep him compliant. Armed guards positioned strategically, a mix of rogue wolves and human mercenaries who had sold their scruples along with their services. And everywhere, the casual cruelty of a system that had operated so long without consequences. It had stopped bothering to hide its brutality. Cale's eyes found her immediately, pulled by the bond that was currently rewriting his neural pathways with painful intensity. She was in a cage near the back, separated from the others in a way that suggested they knew she was different, valuable. Even huddled in the cramped space, he could see she was tall for an Omega, her body carrying the lean strength of someone who had fought their captivity every step of the way. Her hair was a tangled mass of midnight black, so long it pooled around her despite the cage's constraints. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. Violet. Pure, luminous violet. A color that existed only in the oldest bloodlines, the ones the history books claimed had died out centuries ago. Those impossible eyes locked onto his with an intensity that felt like a challenge despite her circumstances. And Cale felt something inside him that had been frozen for decades crack wide open. A human male approached him, all false confidence and the particular arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of a career criminal. "Welcome, Alpha. We weren't expecting such distinguished company, but you're certainly welcome to browse our merchandise. We have some exceptional specimens today, including that violet-eyed beauty in the back. Very rare bloodline. The bidding starts at 50,000. But for you, we could arrange a private sale." He smiled like they were discussing livestock, like the beings in those cages weren't people with lives and families and futures that had been stolen from them. Cale let the silence stretch, watching the human's confidence falter, as he realized something was very wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost conversational, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "How long has this market operated in my territory?" The human's eyes flickered to the guards, calculating odds, trying to determine if he could talk his way out of whatever was coming. 5 years, maybe 6. But we have agreements with your border patrol, with some of your council members. This is sanctioned business, Alpha. We pay our fees. Everything is arranged. Cale smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Marcus had ever seen on his Alpha's face. Those arrangements are terminated, effective immediately. He didn't raise. His voice didn't need to. The Alpha command in those words made every wolf in the valley whimper. The human made the fatal mistake of reaching for the weapon at his belt, and that was all the provocation Cale needed. He didn't shift, didn't need to. His hand shot out with preternatural speed, closing around the human's throat and lifting him off his feet as easily as a child lifting a doll. "You have sold your last Omega," he said quietly. And then he let his wolf show in his eyes. Let this pathetic excuse for a man see exactly what was about to happen. The human's neck snapped with a sound like breaking kindling, and Cale dropped the body without a second glance. The guards surged forward, a coordinated response that suggested military training, but they were moving through molasses compared to an Alpha of Cale's caliber. He tore through them with surgical precision, his decades of combat experience turning the fight into an execution. Bones shattered. Blood painted the snow. Screams cut off abruptly. Marcus and the other guards joined the fray, their own rage ignited by what they were witnessing, by the realization of what had been happening at their border while they had looked the other way. Before you engage with the story further, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because this journey into redemption and justice is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens when an Alpha finally stops making excuses and starts making changes. Within minutes, every trafficker in the valley was dead, their bodies scattered across the snow like broken dolls. Kyle stood in the center of the carnage, his breathing barely elevated, his expensive clothes now ruined with blood that wasn't his. He turned toward the cages, toward the Omegas who were watching him with expressions that ranged from hope to terror to complete dissociation. His wolf howled with the need to go to their mate, but Kale forced himself to move methodically, to break open every cage, to offer the kind of help that came with no strings attached. "You're free," he said to each one, his voice gentle in a way that shocked Marcus. "My guards will escort you home if you have somewhere to go, or offer you sanctuary in my pack if you don't. No one will touch you. No one will hurt you again. You have my word as Supreme Alpha." Most of them scrambled away as soon as the cages opened, their trust so shattered they couldn't process the concept of a helpful alpha. A few accepted the offer of escort, their eyes hollow with trauma that would take years to heal. But she stayed in her cage even after Kale ripped the door from its hinges, those violet eyes watching him with an intelligence that suggested she saw past his gentle words to the truth underneath. He crouched down to her level, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to pull her into his arms and never let go. "I'm Kale Thornridge," he said quietly. "Supreme. Alpha of the Northern Lands. You're my mate, and I'm going to destroy everyone who did this to you." Her laugh was unexpected, bitter, and sharp as broken glass. "Your mate," she repeated, her voice hoarse from screaming or crying or both. "How convenient that you suddenly care about Omega trafficking the moment you find your precious mate bond." She shifted in the cage, and he saw the silver burns on her wrists where the manacles had rubbed her skin raw, saw the bruises in various stages of healing, that painted a map of cruelty across her visible skin. Where was this righteous fury 6 months ago when they first brought me here? Where was it a year ago when they were selling Omegas every week in this same valley? She leaned forward, and despite her circumstances, despite the cage and the chains and the obvious trauma, her presence was commanding. "I'll tell you where it was, Alpha." It was carefully looking the other way, because it was politically convenient, because acknowledging the problem would require you to actually do something about it, and that might upset your carefully balanced power structure. Her words hit harder than any physical blow could have, each one a precision strike against the justifications he had built up over years of willful ignorance. Kale felt something inside him break, not the dramatic shattering of sudden revelation, but the slow, grinding collapse of foundations that had been cracking for years. She was right. She was absolutely right. And the worst part was that he had known it all along. "You're correct," he said finally, and the admission felt like swallowing ground glass. "I have been complicit through my inaction. I have allowed this to continue, because it was easier than confronting the corruption in my own council, easier than admitting that my territory wasn't as orderly as I pretended. I have failed you, and every Omega who suffered while I looked away." He met her eyes, refusing to let himself look away from the condemnation he saw there. "I can't undo that failure, but I can ensure it never happens again." She studied him for a long moment, and he saw the calculations happening behind those remarkable eyes, the weighing of his words against his actions, the fundamental mistrust of alphas that her experience had earned her. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "If you want to tell me." Something flickered across her face, an emotion too complex to parse in the moment. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah Nightbloom. And if that name means anything to you, Alpha, you'll understand why your pretty words about mates and protection ring particularly hollow." Nightbloom. The name hit Kale like a freight train, pulling up every history lesson he had ever learned about the ancient bloodlines. The Nightblooms had been one of the first Omega families, their line stretching back to the founding of Wolf Society itself. They had possessed abilities that modern wolves could barely comprehend, the power to influence pack bonds, to heal wounds that should have been fatal, to see the threads of fate that connected lives across generations. They had also been hunted to near extinction 500 years ago during the Alpha Wars, when powerful wolves had decided that Omegas with that much power were too dangerous to exist. Every history book claimed the line had died out completely, the last Nightbloom executed in a purge that modern wolves preferred not to discuss in detail. "You're Nightbloom," he said. And it wasn't a question. The violet eyes, the presence that was too strong for an Omega who should have been broken by months of captivity, the way his wolf recognized her as something fundamentally important beyond just the mate bond. How is that possible? How have you survived? But even as he asked, he was already reassessing everything he thought he knew about Omega trafficking in his territory. If the traffickers had known what she was, if they had been trying to sell her to the highest bidder, the implications were staggering. Who knew about your heritage? Who was bidding on you? Sarah's expression became, if possible, even more guarded. That's an interesting question, Alpha. One you might have asked 6 months ago if you had bothered to investigate why a supposedly extinct bloodline Omega was being held in a black market in your territory. She shifted again, and he saw her wince as the movement pulled at injuries he couldn't see. The traffickers knew enough to keep me separated, to market me as rare, but not so rare that it would attract the kind of attention that might threaten their operation. But there were buyers. Oh, there were buyers. Alphas from territories across the continent, council members from your own pack, even a few humans who collect supernatural oddities like we're fucking Pokemon cards. She spit the last words with such venom that Cale felt his wolf surge with protective rage. He forced himself to breathe, to think strategically, even though every instinct was screaming at him, to start killing again. The bodies around them were just the visible symptoms of a disease that ran much deeper. If his own council members had been bidding on Sarah, if this market had operated for years with the tacit approval of wolves who were supposed to serve him, then the corruption in his territory was far worse than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. How many others? He asked, his voice rough. How many other markets like this one? Sarah laughed again, that same bitter sound that made something in his chest ache. You're the Supreme Alpha. You tell me. But I can tell you what I heard during my time in that cage. At least 3 other markets in your territory alone. Probably more operating in the buffer zones between packs. A whole network of traffickers, breeders, and buyers who have been operating with impunity for decades because alphas like you found it more convenient to pretend you didn't know. She met his eyes with a challenge that would have been audacious even if she weren't chained in a cage. So forgive me if I don't swoon with gratitude because you finally decided to care when your own mate bond was on the line. Kyle felt the truth of her words settle into his bones like lead. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a single act of violence, wasn't something he could fix by killing the right people and moving on. This was systemic corruption that had flourished under his rule, enabled by his strategic apathy and the priorities that had valued political stability over Omega safety. The realization was devastating, but also clarifying. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring back the Omegas who had suffered while he looked away, but he could ensure that Sarah's contempt was the catalyst for real change, the kind of transformation that would require him to burn down everything he had built on foundations of willful ignorance. He stood up, his decision crystallizing with the finality of pack law. Marcus, he called, and his beta approached with the wariness of someone who knew his alpha was about to do something drastic. Summon the full council to the main hall. Every member, no exceptions. Tell them attendance is mandatory on pain of exile. And send strike teams to every border patrol station. I want reports on every suspicious activity, every unexplained payment, every relationship with rogue elements. If there are other markets operating in my territory, I want them found and destroyed within the week. His voice carried the absolute authority of an alpha who had stopped making excuses and started making changes. Marcus's eyes widened, but he nodded sharply and began issuing orders to the assembled guards. Cale turned back to Sarah, who was watching this display of sudden efficiency with an expression he couldn't quite read. I'm going to carry you out of here, he said gently. Your injuries need treatment, and I suspect you haven't had a proper meal or rest in months. You can refuse. You can choose to go anywhere else. And I'll provide escort and resources to make that happen. But I'm asking you to come to my pack house, to let me prove that my commitment to change is more than just words spoken in the heat of finding my mate. Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she would refuse, and he couldn't blame her if she did. Every experience she'd had with alphas had taught her that their promises were worthless, that their concern lasted only as long as it served their interests. But then she extended her hands, wrists up, showing him the manacles that still bound her. If you're going to make grand gestures, Alpha, start by getting these fucking things off me. And know that I'm not agreeing because of any mate bond. I'm agreeing because I want to watch you try to actually fix the system you've spent decades enabling. I want a front row seat to see if you're capable of real change, or if this is just another alpha performance that will fade as soon as it becomes inconvenient. Cale felt a smile tug at his lips. Despite the gravity of the situation, she was magnificent. This violet-eyed Omega, who had survived horrors that would have broken most wolves and came out the other side with her fire intact. He bent to examine the manacles, recognizing the particular silver alloy that burned Omega's skin on contact. The locks were sophisticated, designed to require specific keys, but Cale simply gripped the metal and pulled. His alpha strength was sufficient to deform the silver enough that the manacles fell away, leaving behind burns that made his wolf howl with rage and grief. He stripped off his jacket, expensive cashmere now ruined with blood, and wrapped it around her shoulders before carefully lifting her from the cage. She stiffened at the contact, but didn't pull away, and he could feel the trembling in her muscles that suggested shock was beginning to set in. The walk back to his vehicles was silent, but Kyle's mind was racing with everything that needed to happen. The council meeting where he would expose the corruption and remove anyone who had profited from Omega trafficking. The investigation into his own border patrols and security forces to root out everyone who had been complicit. The complete overhaul of Omega protection laws that he should have implemented years ago. The establishment of safe houses and support systems for trafficking survivors. The diplomatic nightmare of explaining to neighboring packs why he was suddenly taking such aggressive action against markets that had previously operated with tacit approval. It was overwhelming, the scope of what needed to change. But for the first time in decades, Cale felt like he was moving in the right direction. Sarah remained quiet during the drive back to his pack house, her eyes tracking everything with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned the hard way to always know her exits. Cale kept up a steady stream of quiet information about what would happen when they arrived, the medical care that would be available, the private suite she would have with locks that only she controlled, the absolute prohibition against anyone entering her space without explicit permission. He didn't know if she was listening, but he needed her to understand that this wasn't a rescue that came with strings attached, wasn't him claiming her as property despite the mate bond. The pack house rose from the snowy landscape like a fortress, all stone and timber built to withstand the brutal northern winters. Wolves paused in their activities as Cale's vehicle entered the compound, their nostrils flaring as they caught Sarah's scent and understood what it meant. Their alpha had found his mate. The news would spread through the pack within minutes, carried on the supernatural communication network that connected pack members to each other and to their leader. Kyle could already feel the questions building in the pack bonds, the curiosity and concern, and barely suppressed excitement. He sent out a firm command for privacy, for space, and felt his pack members back off reluctantly. The pack doctor, Helena, was waiting at the entrance, her medical bag already in hand and her expression professionally neutral. She had been with Cale's pack for 20 years, had seen him through countless battles and political crises, and had learned to ask questions later and provide care first. She took one look at Sarah, and her eyes hardened with anger that matched Cale's own. "Get her to the medical wing," she said briskly. "I'll need to assess for silver poisoning, check for internal injuries, and run a full battery of tests." Her gaze flickered to Cale. "You'll want to stay. But I'm telling you now that if you hover, she's going to feel trapped. Give us space." It went against every instinct, leaving his injured mate with someone else. But Cale forced himself to nod. "Sarah needs to know she has choices," he said quietly. "That includes the choice to have medical care without me watching." He looked at Sarah, who had been silent throughout this exchange. "I'll be in my office if you need me. For anything. No conditions, no expectations. Just tell Helena, and I'll come." Sarah's violet eyes studied him with that same unsettling intensity, and he had the distinct impression she was cataloging every word against some internal checklist of alpha behavior. She nodded once, a slight movement that somehow felt like a test passed, and then Helena was whisking her away with the efficient compassion of a medical professional, who had seen too much suffering and refused to become numb to it. Cale stood in the empty hallway for a long moment, his wolf howling with the wrongness of being separated from their mate, before forcing himself toward his office. Marcus was already there, along with his head of security, his chief enforcer, and his senior advisor, all of them wearing expressions that suggested they understood something massive was happening, but weren't sure what. Cale didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have corruption in our council," he said bluntly. "Members who have been profiting from Omega trafficking while we've been pretending the problem doesn't exist. I want a full investigation into every council member's finances, every unexplained source of income, every suspicious transaction. If they've taken money from traffickers, I want evidence that will stand up to pack law." His security chief, a grizzled alpha named Roland, who had served 3 generations of Supreme Alphas, cleared his throat. "That's a significant accusation, Alpha. If we're wrong, if we publicly investigate the council without solid evidence, it could destabilize your entire power base. Some of those wolves have been with your family for generations." The implication was clear. Be sure before you start a war with your own government. Cale felt his wolf surge with alpha dominance, flooding the room with power that made even these experienced warriors drop their eyes. "I found my mate in a cage," he said, each word clipped with barely controlled rage. "In a market that has been operating in my territory for years, with buyers that included members of my own council. I am absolutely certain that I need to root out this corruption, and I'm willing to destabilize whatever needs to be destabilized to make it happen." He let the silence stretch. Let them feel the weight of his resolve. "The council meets in 3 hours. I want preliminary reports on everyone's activities by then. Prioritize anyone who has had contact with rogue groups or unexplained trips to the southern border." Before the conversation could continue, hit that like button if you're invested in seeing Cale actually follow through on his promises. Because the real test of an alpha isn't what they promise in moments of crisis, but what they do when the initial anger fades and the hard work begins. His team scattered to their assignments, and Cale was left alone with the crushing weight of everything he had failed to see, failed to act on, failed to protect. He had built his reputation on strength and strategic brilliance, had prided himself on being the alpha who always stayed 3 moves ahead of his enemies, but he had been blind to the predators operating in his own territory, had allowed his political calculations to override the basic moral imperative to protect the vulnerable. The realization was devastating, but also strangely liberating. He couldn't change the past, but he could ensure the future was different. The council meeting 3 hours later was explosive in its intensity. Cale had gathered evidence with ruthless efficiency, his investigators working at supernatural speed to compile financial records, testimony from border guards, and communications between council members and known traffickers. He laid it out methodically, watching the faces around the table cycle through denial, anger, and in some cases, barely concealed guilt. 3 council members were directly implicated, their involvement so obvious that even their usual political allies couldn't defend them. 2 more had been willfully blind, accepting bribes to look the other way when shipments crossed their patrol zones. And nearly half the council had known something was happening, but had chosen silence over confrontation. "You have no right," Councilman Aldrich snarled, his alpha dominance rising to challenge Cale's authority. "This council operates on the principle of shared governance. You can't unilaterally remove members, because you've suddenly developed a conscience about border security." His supporters murmured agreement, but Cale noticed that several council members were very carefully not meeting anyone's eyes, their silence more damning than any accusation. Cale let Aldrich finish his posturing before standing, his full alpha presence flooding the room with a dominance that made it physically difficult for the others to remain seated. "I am the supreme alpha of the northern lands," he said quietly, and that simple statement carried more authority than all of Aldrich's bluster. "This council serves at my pleasure, advises according to my discretion, and operates within the boundaries of pack law that I am sworn to uphold. You have violated that law. You have profited from the suffering of Omegas, have enabled traffickers to operate in our territory, and have betrayed the fundamental responsibility of leadership. He pulled out 3 formal documents, PAC law declarations that would strip the implicated council members of their positions, their PAC membership, and in the case of the worst offenders, their lives. I am exercising my right as Supreme Alpha to remove you from this council and exile you from my PAC. You have until dawn to be beyond my borders. If you're still here when the sun rises, I will consider it an act of war. The room erupted into chaos, arguments and accusations, flying as the political implications of Cale's actions became clear. He was effectively restructuring his entire government, removing wolves who had been power players for decades, sending a message that no amount of political capital would protect corruption. It was the kind of dramatic purge that could trigger civil war if handled poorly. But Cale had spent the hours before the meeting shoring up support among the wolves who mattered, ensuring that his enforcers and military commanders understood what was at stake. When the shouting died down, Aldrich and his allies were escorted from the hall by armed guards, their protests falling on ears that had heard enough justifications to last a lifetime. The remaining council members sat in shocked silence as Cale laid out his vision for what came next. Complete reformation of Omega protection laws, with penalties severe enough to actually deter trafficking. Establishment of an independent oversight committee to investigate any reports of Omega abuse or illegal trade. Mandatory training for all border patrol and security forces on recognizing and reporting trafficking signs. Safe houses throughout the territory where Omegas in danger could find refuge without questions or judgment. Reparations for trafficking survivors, funded by seizing the assets of everyone involved in the trade. And a formal public acknowledgement of the Northern Land's complicity in allowing the system to flourish. Some of you are wondering if this is sustainable, if I'm going to maintain this level of commitment once the initial crisis passes. Leave a comment below about what accountability measures you think leaders need to have in place to ensure they don't slip back into old patterns, because that's exactly the question Sarah asked me, and it's one I need to answer with actions, not just words. The council meeting lasted hours, every detail debated and refined, but by the end, Cale had a framework for systemic change that went beyond his initial rage-fueled promises. It wasn't enough, would never be enough to make up for the years of suffering he had ignored. But it was a start. He found Sarah in the medical wing's recovery room, her injuries bandaged and her body finally clean after months of captivity. Helena had provided her with comfortable clothes and had clearly respected her boundaries, because Sarah looked more relaxed than she had in the valley, though her eyes were still wary. She was standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, with an expression he couldn't read. "Helena says you're declining." "The mate suite," Cale said quietly from the doorway, careful not to crowd her space. "That you want your own quarters with separate access." Sarah turned to face him, and he saw that some of the worst tension had eased from her shoulders, though she still held herself like someone ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. "I'm not going to play house with you, Alpha. Just because biology says we're supposed to be together. If you want me to even consider this mate bond as anything other than another form of ownership, you're going to have to earn it." She crossed her arms, and despite her smaller size, despite her Omega designation, she radiated a strength that made his wolf want to bow in respect. "Tell me what happened in your council meeting. Tell me if you actually followed through, or if you made comfortable compromises that let you feel better while changing nothing." Cale spent the next hour telling her everything, holding nothing back. The 3 council members in exile, the 2 more under investigation, the complete overhaul of Omega protection laws he was implementing. He showed her the documentation, let her read the exact language of the new regulations, let her see the financial commitments he was making to support trafficking survivors. And when she asked hard questions about enforcement, about what would stop future councils from simply reverting to the old ways, he admitted he didn't have all the answers yet, but was committed to building systems that didn't rely solely on one Alpha's moral clarity. Sarah listened to all of it with an intensity that suggested she was cataloging every word, every promise, every potential loophole. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, her violet eyes distant with thoughts he couldn't access. "My bloodline," she said finally, "carries abilities that the old stories only hint at. Night blooms could see pack bonds. could sense the ties that connected wolves to each other and to their leaders. They could identify corruption by feeling where the bonds had rotted, where loyalty had been replaced by self-interest and fear. She met his eyes. That's why they hunted us to extinction. Because we were inconvenient truth-tellers in a society that preferred comfortable lies. Kyle felt something slot into place. A piece of the puzzle he hadn't known was missing. "You can see it," he said. "The corruption in my pack. The places where the bonds have weakened." Sarah nodded slowly. "I started manifesting the abilities about 6 months before I was taken. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first. Just knew that I could sense things about the wolves around me that I shouldn't have been able to know." Her expression darkened. "The traffickers figured it out when I accidentally revealed information about one of their buyers that I couldn't have learned through normal means. They realized what I was. And the bidding went from thousands to hundreds of thousands overnight. The implications made Cale's mind race. If Sarah could identify corruption, could see the rot in pack structures, she could be invaluable in rooting out the systemic problems he was trying to fix. But asking her to use those abilities, especially so soon after her trauma, felt like exploitation of a different kind. "I won't ask you to use your gifts for my benefit," he said carefully. "You've been used enough. Whatever you choose to share, whatever you choose to keep private, I'll respect that boundary." But he couldn't help adding, "If you're willing, if you wanted to help identify where the corruption runs deepest, it could save Omegas who are suffering right now in places we haven't found yet." Sarah's laugh was softer this time, less bitter, though still carrying an edge of dark humor. "Manipulative, Alpha. Framing it as my choice while making it clear that Omegas are suffering and I have the power to help them." She shook her head, but there was something almost approving in her expression. "I'll help, but not because of the mate bond. And not because you've suddenly discovered your conscience. I'll help because I survived when others didn't, and I owe it to them to make sure this system burns to the ground and something better rises from the ashes." She stepped closer, and Cale held himself perfectly still, letting her control the distance between them. "But know this, Supreme Alpha. I'm watching everything you do. Every decision, every compromise, every moment when it would be easier to slide back into old patterns. And the moment. I see you prioritizing political convenience over Omega safety. I'm gone. And I'm taking my knowledge and abilities to someone who will actually use them for change." It was a threat, and a promise, and a challenge all rolled into one, and Cale felt his respect for her deepen even further. "Deal," he said simply. "Hold me accountable. Call me out when I'm making excuses. Be the conscience I clearly needed years ago." He extended his hand, not as an alpha claiming his Omega, but as an equal, offering partnership. "Help me burn this rotten system down, Sarah Nightbloom. Help me build something worthy of your gifts and your trust." She looked at his hand for a long moment, before reaching out and clasping it firmly, her grip strong, despite the healing burns on her wrists. "For the Omegas who didn't survive," she said quietly. "For the ones still trapped. For the possibility that wolves can be better than our worst instincts. Those are the reasons I'm doing this." She released his hand and stepped back. "Now get out. I need sleep, and I need space, and I need to process everything without an alpha hovering over me, even one who's suddenly pretending to be enlightened." Kyle left without argument, and as he walked through his pack house toward his own empty quarters, he felt the weight of the day settling into his bones. He had killed traffickers, exposed corruption, exiled council members, and begun the process of systemic reform. He had found his mate, and somehow, miraculously, convinced her not to reject him outright, despite having every reason to do so. But the real work was just beginning, and he knew Sarah wouldn't accept anything less than complete transformation. The following weeks were a study in controlled chaos as Cale's reforms began to reshape the northern lands. Strike teams found and destroyed 2 more trafficking markets, liberating dozens of Omegas and adding their testimony to the growing evidence of how deep the corruption ran. The investigations into His border patrols revealed that nearly a third of his security forces had been compromised, either through bribes or intimidation. The trials were public and brutal, with Cale showing no mercy to wolves who had betrayed their fundamental duty to protect pack members. Executions, exiles, and permanent stripping of wolf privileges became common enough that some began to whisper their alpha had become tyrannical in his pursuit of justice. Sarah attended every trial, her violet eyes watching the sow proceedings with an intensity that made the accused wolves squirm. She had agreed to use her abilities to verify testimony, to sense when wolves were lying, or when their pack bonds revealed guilt they tried to hide. Her presence transformed the trials from he said, she said debates into undeniable reckonings with truth. Council members who had thought their political connections would protect them found themselves faced with an Omega who could literally see their corruption, and no amount of clever arguing could override what she could sense in their pack bonds. The backlash was inevitable. Conservative elements in the pack argued that Cale was giving too much power to an Omega, that Sarah's influence was unnatural and dangerous. There were whispers that she was manipulating him through the mate bond, that his sudden concern for Omega rights was just him being pussy-whipped by a female with supernatural abilities. Cale dealt with these challenges the same way he dealt with everything else in those weeks, directly and without compromise. He held pack assemblies where he laid out exactly what had been happening under their noses, forced wolves to confront the reality of the trafficking that had flourished while they looked away. He made it clear that anyone who had a problem with Sarah's involvement could challenge him directly, and not a single wolf was stupid enough to take that offer. But the real transformation happened more quietly, in the safe houses Cale established. Throughout the territory, Omegas who had been hiding in fear began to emerge, began to believe that maybe this time, an alpha's promises weren't empty words. Sarah worked with the survivors, using her abilities to identify which ones needed immediate intervention, which ones were at risk of being reclaimed by traffickers, which ones carried trauma so deep it would take years of careful support to heal. She was relentless and compassionate in equal measure, refusing to coddle anyone, but also refusing to give up on even the most damaged survivors. Cale watched her work with a mixture of awe and growing love that had nothing to do with the mate bond, and everything to do with who she was as a person. She was brilliant and fierce, capable of incredible gentleness with survivors, while being absolutely ruthless with anyone who tried to exploit them. She called him on his shit regularly, pointing out when his reforms were performative rather than substantive, when he was making decisions based on political expedience rather than what was actually right. She was exhausting and exhilarating, and Cale found himself wanting to be worthy of her respect far more than he wanted to claim her as his mate. The turning point came 3 months after that first day in the valley. Cale's investigations had uncovered evidence of a trafficking network that extended far beyond his territory, connections that implicated alphas from at least 6 other packs in a coordinated system of Omega trade. The evidence was solid, testimony from dozens of survivors backed by financial records and communications that couldn't be explained away. But pursuing it would mean taking on some of the most powerful alphas on the continent, risking the political stability he had spent decades building, potentially triggering conflicts that could escalate to war. He presented the evidence to Sarah in his office, late at night when the pack house was quiet. "This is the decision point," he said without preamble. "I can pursue this, can try to build a coalition to take down this network, but it will be dangerous. Other alphas will see it as me overreaching my authority, trying to police territories that aren't mine. Some of my own allies will abandon me rather than risk being caught up in that kind of conflict. Or I can pass this evidence to the Continental Council and let them handle it through official channels, which will be safer, but will also almost certainly result in the guilty wolves receiving light sentences or avoiding consequences entirely through political maneuvering." Sarah studied the documents spread across his desk, her abilities probably sensing connections and corruptions he couldn't see. When she looked up, her eyes held a challenge he had come to recognize and appreciate. "You already know what you need to do," she said quietly. "The question is whether you have the courage to do it when it costs you everything you've built. This is where you find out if your commitment to change is real, or if it only extended as far as your own territory's borders. Kale felt the truth of her words settle into his bones. She was right, of course. She was always right about these things. He had reformed his own territory, had rooted out the corruption he could directly control, but the traffickers he had killed were part of a larger machine that would simply recruit new members if he didn't dismantle the entire structure, and dismantling it would require him to risk everything, to potentially sacrifice the power and influence he had accumulated over 3 decades of careful political maneuvering. He thought about the Omegas still trapped in markets he hadn't found yet, about the survivors who would never truly be safe as long as the network existed, about the future he wanted to build versus the past he had enabled through his inaction. The decision crystallized with a clarity that felt like stepping off a cliff into open air, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "I'm pursuing it," he said. "Whatever it costs, however long it takes. This network ends, and everyone involved faces consequences, regardless of their political connections or territorial boundaries." Sarah's smile was the first one he had seen from her, that carried genuine warmth rather than bitter acknowledgement. "Good," she said simply. "Then I'm with you. Not as your mate, not yet, but as a partner in this fight. Because if you're actually willing to burn down your entire political legacy to protect Omegas you'll never meet, then maybe you're becoming the kind of alpha who deserves trust." She stood from her chair and moved closer, her scent wrapping around him in a way that made his wolf purr with contentment. "Just so we're clear, this doesn't mean I've forgiven you for the years you spent looking the other way. Trust is earned through sustained action over time, not through single dramatic gestures, but it does mean I'm willing to believe you're capable of change." The months that followed tested that belief in ways neither of them had anticipated. Kyle built his coalition carefully, reaching out to alphas who had their own grievances against the trafficking network, who had lost pack members to the trade or who genuinely believed in Omega rights. It was slow, frustrating work, full of setbacks and betrayals, and moments when it seemed like the whole effort would collapse under the weight of political opposition. But Sarah was there through all of it, using her abilities to identify which alphas could be trusted and which ones were secretly working against them, providing intelligence that saved Kale from walking into traps that would have ended his crusade before it could gain momentum. They worked together with an efficiency that would have been remarkable even without the mate bond, their different skill sets complementing each other in ways that made them far more effective than either could have been alone. Kale provided the military force and political authority, while Sarah provided the supernatural insight and direct connection to the Omega community they were trying to protect. Their relationship remained carefully professional, with Sarah maintaining her own quarters and her own independence, but Kale could feel the bond between them strengthening with every shared victory, every moment when they chose to trust each other, despite the easier option of self-protection. The final confrontation came almost a year after that first day in the valley, when Kyle's coalition had gathered enough evidence and enough support to move against the network's leadership. It was a coordinated strike across 6 territories, simultaneous raids on the major trafficking hubs, timed to prevent warnings from allowing key players to escape. Kyle led the assault on the Central Market, a sprawling complex hidden in neutral territory that had been operating for decades with the protection of some of the continent's most powerful wolves. The battle was brutal and bloody, traffickers and their security forces fighting with the desperation of people who knew capture meant execution. Kale fought at the front, his decades of combat experience turning him into a force of nature that carved through enemy lines with preternatural efficiency. But it was Sarah who turned the tide, using her Nightbloom abilities in ways that hadn't been seen in centuries. She could sense the pack bonds of the traffickers, could identify their command structure, and their strongest fighters could even disrupt those bonds in moments of extreme focus, leaving enemy alphas suddenly cut off from the power they drew from their followers. When the dust settled, the network's leadership was dead or captured. Thousands of Omegas were freed, and Kyle's coalition had proven that even the most entrenched corruption could be uprooted if enough wolves were willing to pay the price. But the victory came with costs. Kale had lost allies, had been formally censured by the Continental Council for what they termed overreach of alpha authority, had created enemies who would spend years trying to undermine everything he had built. His territory was secure, his reforms were in place, but his influence on the continental stage was significantly reduced. He stood in the ruins of the central market as his forces began the work of documenting evidence and caring for the freed Omegas, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished and what had been sacrificed. Sarah found him there, her clothes torn and bloody from the fighting, violet eyes bright with the aftermath of using her abilities at their full capacity. "We did it," she said quietly, and there was wonder in her voice beneath the exhaustion. "We actually did it." Cale pulled her close, and for the first time she came willingly, melting into his embrace with a trust that felt more significant than any victory they had won on the battlefield. "We did," he confirmed. "But the work isn't over. The network is broken, but the attitudes that enabled it are still out there. The wolves who think Omegas are property, who believe trafficking is just an unfortunate side effect of a properly hierarchical society, they're still in positions of power. We've won a battle, but the war for real change is going to take generations." Sarah pulled back enough to meet his eyes, and he saw acceptance there, the acknowledgement of hard truths, alongside the satisfaction of genuine progress. "I know," she said, "but we've proven it's possible. We've shown that an alpha can choose Omega safety over political convenience, can sacrifice influence to do what's right, can actually follow through on promises of change even when it costs everything." She smiled, and it transformed her face into something luminous. "That's worth more than you know, Cale, because every Omega who was freed today, every survivor who sees that justice is possible, they'll carry that forward. They'll demand better from their own alphas. They'll refuse to accept the old excuses." As you've been following this journey, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because stories like this, stories about real change and earned redemption, are what we're all about here. And leave a comment about what you think real accountability looks like, because these questions matter beyond the story. Cale felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "You're right," he said, as usual. Then, because he couldn't help himself, he added, "Does this mean you're ready to accept the mate bond? To actually give us a chance as partners in more than just revolution?" Sarah laughed, the sound lighter than he had ever heard from her. "You're impossible," she said, but there was affection in her voice. "Yes. Supreme Alpha, I think I'm ready to explore what we could be together, now that you've proven you're capable of growth. But don't think this means I'm going to stop calling you out when you're being an idiot. The mate bond doesn't come with a mute button for inconvenient truths." Kyle grinned, pulling her closer. "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The kiss they shared tasted of blood and smoke, and the promise of a future built on foundations of genuine justice rather than willful ignorance. It wasn't the fairy tale ending where everything was magically fixed by true love's kiss. It was something better, something real, the beginning of a partnership between two people who had both been forged in fire and come out the other side committed to being better than their worst moments. The epilogue came 5 years later, with Cale and Sarah standing on the same ridge where he had first caught her scent. The valley below had been transformed from a site of horror into a memorial garden. Every Omega who had died in trafficking, remembered by name on stones that would stand for centuries. The market structures had been demolished, the ground consecrated by Omega priestesses, using rituals from Sarah's Nightbloom heritage, turning a place of suffering into a place of remembrance and healing. The northern lands had changed almost beyond recognition. Omega protection laws were the most progressive on the continent, with enforcement mechanisms that actually worked, and penalties severe enough to deter all but the most foolish traffickers. The council now included equal representation from all designations, with Omegas having genuine political power rather than token positions. Safe houses had expanded into full support networks, providing education, job training, and mental health resources for any Omega who needed them. And Sarah's influence had spread far beyond Cale's territory, her Nightbloom abilities training a new generation of wolves who could sense corruption and hold leaders accountable. Their relationship had deepened into something neither had imagined that first day in the valley. Sarah had never lost her sharp tongue or her willingness to challenge Cale when he needed it, but she had also opened herself to the softness of being loved, of having a partner who proved daily that he valued her safety and autonomy over his own convenience. They had children now, 2 pups who showed signs of inheriting both alpha strength and Nightbloom abilities, a combination that would have terrified the old guard, but that Cale and Sarah were raising to understand power as responsibility rather than privilege. It wasn't perfect. There were still traffickers operating in other territories, still alphas who clung to the old ways, still omegas suffering in places Cale's reforms hadn't reached. But the fundamental truth had shifted. Omegas across the continent now knew that change was possible, that they didn't have to accept abuse as inevitable, that there were alphas who would choose their safety over political expediency, and that knowledge was spreading, creating pressure for reform even in the most conservative packs. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly, her hand in his as they looked out over the memorial garden. "Sacrificing your political influence, making enemies of wolves who used to be allies, choosing the hard path when you could have just stopped at reforming your own territory?" Cale thought about the question seriously, giving it the consideration it deserved. "Every day," he admitted. "There are moments when I wonder if I could have accomplished more by working within the system, by maintaining my influence, and using it for gradual change." He squeezed her hand. "But then I think about the Omegas who are alive today, because we broke the network. I think about the survivors who have built lives they never thought they'd have. I think about our children growing up in a world that's genuinely better than the one I inherited, and I know that the only real regret would have been if I had continued looking away, continued making excuses, continued prioritizing my own power over other people's lives." Sarah leaned against him, her presence a comfort and a challenge in equal measure. "Good answer," she said. "But I'm still going to keep asking, because the moment you stop questioning whether you made the right choice is the moment you become dangerous again. Complacency is how alphas like you ended up enabling trafficking in the first place. You got comfortable with your power and stopped seeing the suffering you could have prevented." It was a harsh truth, but Cale had learned to appreciate Sarah's refusal to let him off the hook. "That's why I need you," he said. "To keep me honest. To remind me that being better is a daily choice, not a destination you reach and then get to relax." He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent that still made his wolf sing with joy after 5 years together. "I love you, Sarah Nightbloom, for your strength, for your refusal to accept easy answers, for choosing to believe I could change even when you had every reason to write me off as another alpha making empty promises." Sarah turned in his arms, her violet eyes holding the depth of shared history and hard-won trust. "I love you too," she said. "You infuriating, complicated, surprisingly capable of growth supreme alpha." She kissed him gently. "Now let's go home. We have a council meeting tomorrow where we're voting on extending our Omega protection model to the Eastern Territories, and I want to prepare our arguments so thoroughly that even the conservatives can't find a loophole." Cale laughed, the sound carrying across the valley and echoing off the mountains. "That's my mate," he said with undisguised pride. "Never satisfied with what we've already accomplished. Always pushing for the next victory." He took one last look at the memorial garden, at the names carved in stone representing lives he hadn't saved, but would never forget. "For them," he said quietly. "For every Omega still waiting for an alpha to choose their safety over convenience. That's why we keep fighting." They walked back to their vehicle hand in hand, 2 people who had been forged in the fires of their worst moments and had chosen to become better. Together, the northern lands stretched out behind them, transformed but still imperfect, a work in progress that would require constant vigilance and constant choice to maintain. But Cale had learned that real change didn't come from single dramatic gestures. It came from the daily decision to be better than yesterday, to prioritize the vulnerable over the powerful, to build systems that protected people rather than exploited them. It came from mates who refused to let you make excuses, from survivors who demanded accountability, from the grinding, unglamorous work of transformation that happened one policy change, one rescued Omega, one challenged assumption at a time. And as the sun set over the memorial garden, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson, Cale Thornridge felt something he had never expected to feel that day he first caught Sarah's scent. Peace. Not the false peace of ignorance or the empty peace of unchallenged power, but the deep peace that came from knowing he was finally living in alignment with his values, finally using his strength to protect rather than to dominate, finally worthy of the extraordinary Omega who had chosen to trust him despite every reason not to. The bandits who had sold Omegas at the border were ashes now, and from those ashes, something better had grown. It was enough. For today, it was enough.